It's 3 p.m. here in California, and I'd like to welcome you to the 15th Annual 9/11 Film Festival here at the Grand Lake Theater in Oakland, California. We're going to get started right now at 3 o'clock. We're going to go straight through until 11 p.m. tonight. We're being live streamed for all of the films and all the speakers at noliesradio.org. That's noliesradio.org. This event, of course, is being put on every year by the San Francisco 9/11 Truth Alliance. So we want to thank them very much for this wonderful community event that we can count on every year. I'm Falkner. I produce a weekly 1-hour political economy radio show, Guns and Butter, that airs every morning, Wednesday, 9 a.m. Eastern on WBAI in New York City. And the show is also carried on many Pacifica affiliates. And of course, Guns and Butter has been banned in Berkeley by KPFA. It's been a year now. So KPFA management is going to decide what you should hear. As Kevin Barrett once pointed out, they're censoring you. They're not just censoring me. And that's after 17 long years of programming and incredible financial support from KPFA listeners to that station. We begin the festival with a brief 2011 BBC report which casts doubt on the official account of the raid that allegedly killed Osama bin Laden. Please note, on camera, Shavir says the man identified as bin Laden is his neighbor, Akbar Khan, whom he knows very well and who owns the house in Abbottabad said to be that of bin Laden. Blowback, or Bloody Treason, was written by Vic Sadot after reading Crossing the Rubicon by Michael Rupert, a former Los Angeles narcotics detective turned 9/11 truth investigator. Well, as an aside there, Mike Rupert was the first person to appear on Guns and Butter 1 month after 9/11, and we were able in that show to establish foreknowledge of those events. Vic calls for the events of 9/11 to be treated as a criminal act rather than simply accepting what politicians claim about the attacks, and highlights the verifiable facts and the unanswered questions presented by 9/11 truth scholars. This song was released on September 11th, 2011 on a CD titled 9/11 Truth and Justice Songs, available through cdbaby.com. Vic's music was twice featured on the Corbett Report. Okay, I'm announcing a series of videos that we're going to be showing. Following Blowback, or Bloody Treason, Vic's friend, Kevin Barrett, well, Kevin Barrett is a lot of people's friends. Vic's friend Kevin Barrett will speak about his life, about Vic's life, that is. Kevin is an author, journalist, and radio host. He holds a PhD in Islamic Studies and Arabic, and he's a frequent television and radio guest. He's skeptical of official stories and enjoys debating Fox News hosts and Zionists. And also, he's the host of False Flag Weekly News, which is also live streamed by noliesradio.org, and that is every Friday morning here in California at 8 a.m., so check that out. Okay, sit tight for the videos. Thank you.
An image the White House wants the world to see. Apparently a disheveled and much diminished Osama bin Laden watching himself on TV. The footage was edited by the Pentagon and released without sound. It's said to be one of 5 videos found in bin Laden's compound. The image was front page news in Pakistan today, but in Abbottabad, where he met his end, there was plenty of skepticism. It's all a fake. Nothing happened, said Mohammed, who's been selling newspapers here for 50 years. Shabir says it's a case of mistaken identity. He claims the man in the picture is his neighbor.
His name is Akbar Khan. He owns the house they said was Osama's house. I know him very well.
If the aim was to persuade the doubters, it didn't work here.
This picture is not Osama. very suspicious.
This picture.
It is very suspicious, and it is made by advanced technology.
Made by computer?
By computer, yeah, ma'am.
We've now spoken to more than 50 people in the market, and only one believes that the man in the video watching television was in fact Osama bin Laden. People here say the Americans haven't proven anything. They haven't shown bin Laden's dead body. Many still don't believe that the Al-Qaeda leader was living here or that he was killed here. It's unclear when and where the videos were made. Tonight, President Obama said bin Laden must have had some sort of support network in Pakistan, perhaps involving people in government, which must be investigated. Orla Gearan, BBC News, Abbottabad.
Well, the day was 9/11 in the year 2001. That's the day the war on terror was officially begun. When 2 planes took down 3 buildings in a scene of shock and awe. Before they hauled away the rubble, it was a crime scene for the law. Who had the means, who had the motive, who could do this crime and live, who had the opportunity, who benefits to what degree. We need a great detective's logic, forensics, facts and laws of physics, not leaps of faith, just steps to reason. Was it blowback or bloody treason? Was it blowback or bloody treason? Towers fell into the footprints, didn't fall sideways at all. It only took about 10 seconds. What explains that fast free fall? Only explosive demolition, causing vacuums in the core, turning most things into powder, molten steel for weeks or more. The Pentagon was hit by something. Surveillance photos weren't released. Our military, they did nothing, did not defend the now deceased. Rice and Myers got promoted for failing at this crisis time. To pre-planned wars they were devoted, and the pretext was the crime. Who had the means, who had the motive, who could do this crime and live, who had the opportunity, who benefits to what degree. We need a great detective's logic, forensic facts and laws of physics, not leaps of faith, just steps to reason. Was it blowback or bloody treason? Was it blowback or bloody treason? Across the fields of Pennsylvania, crash flight UA-93. Ask your media to explain you the far-flung scattering of debris. Show us proof and show us photos. We might buy your alibis. Or did your war games led by Cheney all go live behind your lies? There were warnings, whistleblowers, and they tried to make it stop. Intel agents, FBI guys, blocked by moles up at the top. Building 7, the command post for a New York false flag op. No plane hit it, but it imploded. Give that crime scene to a cop. Who had the means, who had the motive, who could do this crime and live, who had the opportunity, who benefits to what degree. We need a great detective's logic, forensic facts and laws of physics, not leaps of faith, just steps to reason. Was it blowback or bloody treason? Was it blowback or bloody treason? Soon they're patsies in the plot. Able danger named some culprits. Go back off from what you got. Don't you spoil our wars for oil. Domination through puppets. You've got families, keep your mouth shut. Don't mess with our state secrets. Was it blowback at the empire? Was it treason from inside? What else perished in those fires? Was it alright to decide? Is that T-probe going nowhere? Into army anthrax spores? Surely Congress should be knowing as a target of these wars. Who had the means, who had the motive? Who could do this crime and live? Who had the opportunity? Who benefits to what degree? We need a great detective's logic, forensic facts and laws of physics. Nothing's of fate, just steps to reason. Was it blowback or bloody treason? Was it blowback or bloody treason?
All right, Vic Sadot, what a great guy. If you're not familiar with his work, there are videos in the lobby, and there's a CD Baby, and you can look for him on YouTube and things like that, S-A-D-O-T. I'm Kevin Barrett, and since 2006, when 9/11 Truth was thrust on me as my full-time job, I'm making pilgrimages every September 11th. Originally, I went to Ground Zero, and now for 5 or more years, I guess, I've been coming out here to the Grand Lake Theater. Yeah, and this is a place to be. And the main reason I come here is to see my friends. And sadly, this year, one of those friends is no longer with us. One of my best friends in 9/11 Truth, Vic Sadot. He's the Berkeley broadside balladeer and a truth troubadour. He passed away suddenly and unexpectedly last October 6th. And that was the day of the big election fraud event here at the Grand Lake Theater. He was supposed to introduce the event, but he didn't show up. Worried organizers went to his apartment and found him dead there. And this was a huge shock to a whole lot of us. You know, Vic was such a powerful and lively presence and great singer-songwriter. I mean, this is pretty good stuff. Even the people that he occasionally annoyed, which was pretty much everybody at one time or another, couldn't help responding to his passionate and sincere commitment to truth and justice. Vic was creative and playful as well as dedicated. His music spoke from the heart. He was a walking, talking, singing reminder that we need to get both our hearts and our minds engaged. You know, of all the amazing people I met at the very first 9/11 Truth event I attended, which was the 2005 Emergency Convergence in Washington, D.C., people like David Ray Griffin, Cynthia McKinney, Webster Tarpley, Peter Dale Scott, Hamook, Ken Jenkins, Barry Zwicker, Bonnie Falkner, Peter Phillips, and a whole lot of great folks, including a bunch of other great folks who are here that I probably am not remembering to name. Vic was actually, in some ways, the most vividly memorable. I spent a couple hours sitting on a lawn in D.C. next to Vic and really enjoyed his company. And when I came out here to the film festival, part of it was so I could do things like play ping pong with Vic and my kids on the terrace of the Seal Rock Inn. I remember doing that. One of the things I really loved about Vic was his commitment to free speech. Yeah, we're a little too loud. We want to turn down the echo. Turn down the echo. Oh, okay, thank you. So a couple of years ago, when one single loudmouth Zionist Islamophobe got me banned from the Berkeley Fellowship of Unitarian Universalists and got my event canceled, Vic stood up against that, put up a great fight, and we ended up doing the event at the apartment complex where Vic lived. And there was a big turnout because the controversy got people interested. I appreciate his commitment to the fight against Islamophobia, too. Whether it was Bill Maher or somebody from InfoWars or whatever, Vic would always call out those people. I also loved his sense of humor. If you're as ferociously intense as Vic is, you'd better have a sense of humor. So, hanging on to your humanity in these trying times is kind of an uphill battle sometimes, and a lot of folks out there, unfortunately, are failing, present company accepted. But Vic, man, that guy really was alive and human. So I'm grateful to Vic Sadot and to all of you for being so kind and welcoming and fun, and, of course, for being so steadfastly committed to truth and justice. So I really have to say that I miss Vic, and I wish him Godspeed. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi rajiun.
Yeah, Blowback or Bloody Treason, that was really good. Vic was such a fighter. Oh my goodness. He would just go to work on any sort of a struggle. And he was very upset when Guns and Butter got banned. And I guess it was shortly after that that he passed away. So that was really sad. Okay, so we have some videos coming up. Our next video is James Corbett's September 2018 essay, Secret Lie That Started the Afghan War. How did the war in Afghanistan start, and how did NATO become involved in this conflict? These details are never discussed because they have for nearly 2 decades been hidden behind a shroud of secrecy. But now, after nearly 2 decades of lies, the remarkable truth about the secret documents that helped launch the Afghan war can finally be revealed. So that's our next video. Following that, we feature a 2014 C-SPAN interview in which former 9/11 Commission Vice Chair Lee Hamilton was asked by a caller if the question of the collapse of World Trade Center 7 had come up during the Commission's investigation. The purpose is to reveal how phony and untruthful one of the commissioners entrusted to investigate the 9/11 attack can be and was. And by the way, many, many years ago, several of those commissioners came out here and held many different events around the Bay Area, and I interviewed one of them, and they were just so phony. That was my experience as well. Okay, in our final video of this section, filmmaker John Massaria documents the October 2014 donation of a controversial work of art which the curators had requested for their permanent collection to the 9/11 Memorial Museum in New York City. The work is called Questions, and that's exactly what artist Anthony Freda has about the events of that fateful day, September 11th, 2001. This is an excerpt from Massaria's 2015 documentary, Behind Truth Art. Thank you.
Yet another surge of violence in Afghanistan, including suicide bombings by the Taliban and retaliatory airstrikes by US forces, is reminding the world once again of the fact that the Afghan war is far from over.
In Afghanistan, fierce battles continuing over the control of the strategic city of Ghazni 4 days after the Taliban attacked the city, killing more than 200 people, including over 100 soldiers and police officers. Many residents have fled the city.
Ghazni morphed into an urban battlefield last Friday. People were trapped for 5 days in their homes as thousands of Taliban fighters and Afghan soldiers fought in the streets. US helicopters, drones and a B-1 bomber patrolled overhead.
In Afghanistan, Taliban fighters overran a military base, killing at least 17 soldiers. They attacked the site in northern Faryab province and claimed dozens of soldiers surrendered.
The horrific attack is a clear effort to foment sectarian violence and hold back the Afghan people's hopes for a future of peace and security. It reminds us once again the importance of reaching a peaceful solution to the conflict in Afghanistan. The United States continues to stand with the government of Afghanistan and the people of Afghanistan and will continue to support their efforts to achieve peace and security in their country.
Peace and security. For 17 years now, the American people and the people of the world have listened to the U.S. State Department tell us how the American military is working to bring peace and security to Afghanistan. But this lie is self-refuting. At 17 years, the Afghan War is now the longest war in American history, and despite recent reports about negotiations between the US and the Taliban, the deployment of troops in the country has actually increased in the Trump era.
Breaking news on the nation's long war in Afghanistan. President Trump in a primetime address declaring the U.S. must continue the fight.
The consequences of a rapid exit are both predictable and unacceptable.
And while he didn't commit to a specific number of additional troops, although he said we would see overwhelming force, the president has given Defense Secretary Mattis the authority to set troop levels, and Mattis has favored sending in about 4,000 more U.S. troops.
But as the US falls deeper and deeper into the Afghan quagmire, we risk forgetting how this war was actually authorized. The public is merely reminded, in Pavlovian fashion, that
9/11, the worst terrorist attack in our history, was planned and directed from Afghanistan.
But how was that determination made? Who made it? When? And how did NATO become involved in this conflict? These details are never discussed because they have, for nearly 2 decades, been hidden behind a shroud of secrecy. As we shall see, the entire war was waged on a false pretense based on supposed evidence that was classified and withheld from the public. But now, after nearly 2 decades of lies, the remarkable truth about the secret documents that helped launch the Afghan War can finally be revealed. This is the story of the secret lie that started the Afghan War. You're watching the Corbett Report. Just 1 day after 9/11, while the toxic dust was still settling on Ground Zero, the North Atlantic Council, NATO's decision-making body, met to discuss NATO's response to the attacks.
On September the 12th, the North Atlantic Council met again in response to the appalling attacks perpetrated yesterday against the United States of America. The Council agreed that if it is determined that this attack was directed from abroad against the United States, it shall be regarded as an action covered by Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, which states that an armed attack against one or more of the allies in Europe or in North America shall be considered an attack against them all. Article 5 of the Washington Treaty stipulates that in the event of attacks falling within its purview, each ally will assist the party that has been attacked by taking such action as it deems necessary. Accordingly, the United States NATO allies stand ready to provide the assistance that may be required as a consequence of these acts of barbarism.
The Washington Treaty, more formally known as the North Atlantic Treaty, is the founding document of NATO. Consisting of 14 articles, it lays out the obligations of the signatory nations to their fellow NATO members. Article 5 states that the parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all, and consequently they agree that if such an armed attack occurs, each of them, in exercise of the right of individual or collective self-defense recognized by Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations, will assist the party or parties so attacked by taking forthwith, individually and in concert with the other parties, such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force, to restore and maintain the security of the North Atlantic area. That the North Atlantic Council discussed the invocation of Article 5 on September 12, 2001, is no small matter. It had never been invoked in the history of NATO up to that point, and its invocation would commit NATO forces to whatever war the US launched in the wake of the 9/11 attacks. But who directed those 9/11 attacks? That was the question, and, as Lord Robertson indicated, it would require the US to demonstrate that the attack was directed from abroad. On October 2, 2001, the US government's official answer to that question was provided by Ambassador Frank Taylor, the United States Department of State Coordinator for Counterterrorism. On that day, Taylor briefed the North Atlantic Council on al-Qaeda's alleged connection to the events of 9/11.
This morning, the United States briefed the North Atlantic Council on the results of their investigation into who was responsible for the horrific terrorist attacks which took place on the 11th of September. The briefing addressed the events of 11th September themselves, the results of the investigation so far, what is known about Osama bin Laden and the al-Qaeda organisation and their involvement in the attacks and in previous terrorist activity, and the links between al-Qaeda and the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. The facts are clear and compelling. The information presented points conclusively to an al-Qaeda role in the 11th of September attacks.
So clear and compelling was Taylor's briefing that the Council agreed to invoke Article 5 and commit NATO's forces to the US government's war of terror.
On the basis of this briefing, it has now been determined that the attack against the United States of America on the 11th of September was directed from abroad and shall therefore be regarded as an action covered by Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, which states that an armed attack on one or more of the allies in Europe or North America shall be considered as an attack against them all. I want to reiterate yet again today that the United States of America can rely on the full support of its 18 NATO allies in the campaign against international terrorism.
And, just like that, NATO members were committed to an operation in Afghanistan that sees their troops remaining in the country to this very day. So what information did Ambassador Taylor present in that briefing? The 9/11 Commission, which would go on to deliver the official government conspiracy theory of 9/11 in its 2004 final report, still had not even been established. In fact, the establishment of such a commission was at that time still being actively blocked by the Bush administration. And the mistranslated tape that the Pentagon would later falsely label the Osama bin Laden confession tape had still not been magically discovered in a random house in Jalalabad. At this point, there had been no official evidence presented to the public that demonstrated that the operation was directed and coordinated from Afghanistan by al-Qaeda. Surely, then, the Taylor briefing would be filled with evidence that would put to rest any
outrageous conspiracy theories concerning the attacks of September the 11th.
But there's just one problem. The Taylor report was classified, and any evidence it contained showing an al-Qaeda link to 9/11 was hidden from the public.
Today's was a classified briefing, so I cannot give you all the details. Briefings are also being given directly by the United States to allies in their capitals.
And so, for nearly a decade, the US government's evidence that al-Qaeda had directed the 9/11 attacks, the very evidence that was used to launch the war on Afghanistan in particular, and America's war of terror in general, was forbidden to the public, hidden behind a cloud of official secrecy. But then, in 2009, IntelWire.com quietly posted a document online under the title Secret Post-9/11 Briefing to World Leaders. The document is a US State Department cable addressed to the American embassies in the NATO countries and American allies around the world under the subject line, September 11, Working Together to Fight the Plague of Global Terrorism and the Case Against al-Qaeda. The cable is dated October 1st, 2001, the day before Ambassador Taylor's meeting with the North Atlantic Council, and instructs its recipients to brief their host country's government on the information linking the al-Qaeda terrorist network, Osama bin Laden, and the Taliban regime to the September 11th terrorist attack on the World Trade Center and Pentagon and the crash of United Airlines Flight 93. The document went largely unnoticed until earlier this year, when Professor Niels Harrit wrote an article, The Mysterious Frank Taylor Report, the 9/11 document that launched US-NATO's war on terrorism in the Middle East, connecting the dots between this document and the briefing that Ambassador Taylor gave to the North Atlantic Council.
This is a nice little story about grassroots activism, actually, and it starts in 2009 when I got an email from a Norwegian truth activist. His name is Torstein Vidal, and he sent me this PDF with a message, "Did you see this?" And I hadn't seen this, and I opened it and read it, and it appeared to be the instructions going from the American State Department to all representations in the world, American representations in the world, embassies, consulates, and about what to think and what to say about 9/11. And I did not find the content particularly controversial. This is in 2009, because what was in there was completely in accordance with the official version. That is nothing, basically. And but it was very long, and it was meticulous in instructing the recipients of this depeche, I suppose you call it in English, about what to do with it. Not to put it anywhere, only to use it for oral presentations. But at that time, I did not realize the importance of this document, because it weren't until 2012, as I recall, that Michel Kusodowski came out with a pivotal paper about what happened in Brussels in the days after 9/11. Still, this document was sitting on my hard drive. But about a year ago, another activist, a brilliant Danish journalist, his name is Tommy Hansen, and he should be mentioned. He's a beacon on our local scene, and unfortunately, he passed away very recently. But I want his name to be mentioned in this connection because when I was talking with Tommy, I said casually that, well, I have the depeche which was sent to the American representations about what to say and what to think about 9/11. And I said, well, I would like to see that. All right. So I went back home and dug it out from my archives. And at that moment, for the first time, I looked at the date. Because according to the email address, it had been sent out on October the 2nd. And the document itself is dated on October the 1st. And then it snapped. That what a coincidence, because this was the same day as when Frank Taylor was giving his presentation in Brussels, and about a day before all the national governments were briefed. So I started to take a closer look, and then some details appeared that was striking. One thing is that Lord Robertson, in his press conference, is reading a section from this document.
The facts are clear and compelling. We know that the individuals who carried out these attacks were part of the worldwide terrorist network, Al-Qaeda, headed by Osama bin Laden and his key lieutenants, and protected by the Taliban.
There, in Lord Robertson's own mouth, at the press conference announcing the delivery of the Taylor report, are the very words from the document itself. The connection is undeniable. This State Department cable contains the talking points for the briefing that Taylor delivered to the North Atlantic Council. Crucially, if unsurprisingly, the document presents absolutely no proof or evidence establishing a link between Al-Qaeda and 9/11. After spending a full 15 pages talking in generalities about terror, about the US government's officially sanctioned history of al-Qaeda, and of previous attacks linked to al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, the document finally arrives at Part 3, purporting to demonstrate al-Qaeda's involvement in the attacks. But Part 3 begins by admitting that the investigation into the attacks is still in the early stage, and that there are still gaps in our knowledge. It then goes on to detail circumstantial evidence that would not even rise to the level of warranting an indictment, let alone a conviction in a court of law. After asserting without evidence that several of the alleged hijackers had been identified as known bin Laden associates, without clarifying the source of that identification, let alone how their identities and status as hijackers had been determined, we are then told that bin Laden and his associates seemed to be anticipating what we could only identify as an important event or activity. Finally, the document talks about how the incident is tactically similar to earlier attacks, because it involved planning and a desire to inflict mass casualties. And that is it. That is the sum total of the evidence that both the document itself and Lord Robertson, evidently reading notes from Taylor's briefing, calls
clear and compelling.
That this is, in my mind, with no doubt, simply the legal basis for 18 years of perpetual war in the Middle East. This is the basis for NATO's activation of Article 5. And so what is in the document? What is the evidence? What is the evidence which Lord Robertson calls clear and compelling? None. There's absolutely no evidence in that paper. It's free for everyone to see, and I'm sure you'll present it to your audience.
All of this is in keeping with what we have long known about the war on Afghanistan. It was not waged in response to the 9/11 attacks, but was in fact prepared well in advance. Al-Qaeda and the events of September 11th were nothing more than a convenient pretense for the US government to justify their illegal invasion and occupation of a key geostrategic landmass in South Asia. In 1997, just 4 years before the NATO invasion, former National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote that, "For America, the chief geopolitical prize is Eurasia. Now a non-Eurasian power is preeminent in Eurasia, and America's global primacy is directly dependent on how long and how effectively its preponderance on the Eurasian continent is sustained." Specifically, Brzezinski pinpointed Afghanistan and its neighbors, an area he called the Eurasian Balkans, as the most geopolitically significant region to control for its gas and oil reserves and mineral deposits. He argued that some form of extended American military intervention in the region would be necessary, warning that a global consensus on its foreign policy imperatives would be impossible, except in the circumstance of a truly massive and widely perceived direct external threat. Later that year, a senior delegation from the Taliban came to the United States for meetings with UNICAL about securing the rights for a gas pipeline from Turkmenistan to Pakistan across Afghanistan. In 2002, it was revealed that the United States had been negotiating with the Taliban to secure those oil interests, and that American negotiators had told the Taliban that they had a choice. You have a carpet of gold, meaning an oil deal, or a carpet of bombs. Shortly after the 9/11 attacks, a former Pakistani foreign secretary revealed to the BBC that a senior American official had told him in mid-July of 2001 that military action against Afghanistan would go ahead by the middle of October. When the Bush administration came into office, its first substantive national security decision directive, NSPD-9, called for military options against Taliban targets in Afghanistan, including leadership, command control, air and air defense, ground forces, and logistics, and was presented to the president on September 4th, 2001, 7 days before 9/11.
Although this National Security Presidential Directive was originally a highly classified document, we've arranged for portions of it to be declassified to help the Commission in its work, and I will describe some of it today. The strategy set as a goal the elimination of the al-Qaeda network and threat, and ordered the leadership of relevant U.S. departments and agencies to make the elimination of al-Qaeda a high priority and to use all aspects of our national power, intelligence, financial, diplomatic, and military to meet that goal. And it directed the Secretary of Defense to, and I quote, ensure that contingency planning processes include plans against al-Qaeda and associated terrorist facilities in Afghanistan, including leadership, command control and communications, training and logistics facilities, and against Taliban targets in Afghanistan, including leadership, command control, air and air defense, ground forces and logistics.
Dr. Rice has stated that she asked the National Security Council staff in her first week in office for a new presidential initiative on al-Qaeda. In early March, the staff was directed to craft a more aggressive strategy aimed at eliminating the al-Qaeda threat. The first draft of that approach in the form of a presidential directive was circulated by the NSC staff in June of 2001, and a number of meetings were held that summer at the Deputy Secretary level to address the policy questions involved, such as relating an aggressive strategy against Taliban to U.S.-Pakistan relations. By the first week of September, the process had arrived at a strategy that was presented to principals and later became NSPD 9, the President's first major substantive national security decision directive. It was presented for a decision by principals on September 4th, 2001, 7 days before the 11th, and later signed by the President with minor changes and a preamble to reflect the events of September 11th in October.
The invasion of Afghanistan was not about al-Qaeda. It was not the response of the U.S. government to the evidence connecting the Taliban to al-Qaeda and al-Qaeda to 9/11 that was missing from Ambassador Taylor's report. It was a geopolitical gambit in search of a justification. And the events of 9/11 were the justification that the U.S. used to sell NATO and the world on the war in Afghanistan. Worse, 9/11 was the excuse for the entire war of terror itself, the complete transformation of the Middle East that is taking place thanks to American military might. The Taylor report was a blank check drawn on the events of that day, a check that is still being cashed.
That this is the legal and the moral foundation and political foundation for the launch of the uninterrupted destruction of the Middle East. That's what it is. The 18 years of wars, we have refugees running all over the highways in Europe. Europe is going down for the load of refugees and migrants. And it all started there. It's all emerges from this single document, legally, morally, and politically. That's why this document is important. It is the Achilles heel, like Building 7 is the Achilles heel of the destruction of World Trade Center. So you may be cynical. Okay, then you can be cynical about everything. But if there is any moral left in our Western society, this light should be shined on this document, because this document is the legal, and I say it again, the legal and the moral basis for launching of the NATO wars in the Middle East. And that's something, I think.
17 years of warfare and bloodshed. 17 years of attack and counterattack. 17 years of tears and shattered lives. 17 years of lies. And all of it based on the foundational lie of 9/11 and this virtually unknown document. But now the truth of this deception is in our hands, and it is only by exposing that deception that we can ever hope to derail the wars waged in its name and stop the death and destruction it has wrought.
The Corbett Report is brought to you by the Corbett Report subscriber, a weekly newsletter featuring James Corbett's international forecaster editorial, recommended reading and viewing, discounts on Corbett Report DVDs, and once a month, a subscriber-only video. Sign up today to start receiving your copy at corbettreport.com/support.
Washington Journal continues.
Well, for 34 years, Lee Hamilton served as a member of Congress, a Democrat from Indiana. He also served as the vice chair of the 9/11 Commission, and he currently runs the Center on Congress at Indiana University. Lee Hamilton served in Congress from 1965 to 1999. During that time frame, he was chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, chair of the Intelligence Committee, the vice chair of the 9/11 Commission. He was also a co-chair, along with James Baker, of the Iraq Study Group in 2006. Phil, Centerville, Massachusetts. About 5 minutes left with our guest. Go ahead.
Yes, good morning, Representative. I have two questions. The first question is, and I'm not a birther, 9/11 truther. I just want to know, did the question of Building 7, did that question come up and how it collapsed during the commission? And also, if it didn't, why not?
Building 7 was a major focus of our investigation. Building 7 was not one of the really big towers, but it was a substantial building, I think 30, 40 stories high. It collapsed. It was not hit directly by the airplanes, and there was a huge debate, still is a debate, as to why that building collapsed. We on the commission were not engineers, certainly not experts on why buildings collapse. What we did was we consulted with the engineers of the country, and they came up with their best judgment as to why that building went down. I don't remember all the details, but the basic point of it was that there was intense heat developed within the building. The sprinkler systems did not work, and such intense heat built up that the building eventually collapsed. Now, a lot of people have been looking into that since 9/11 Commission reported. They've had a lot of criticism of the Commission because they didn't think we explored it properly. We did what we could do. We consulted the experts. And of course, experts often disagree with one another. So I think that debate continues. I've heard all kinds of explanations as to why Building 7 collapsed. I don't pretend to be an expert on that. Some of the ideas put forward don't make a lot of sense to me, but then I'm no engineer and I don't know anything much about architecture. But we took the word of the best advice we could get, and they gave the reason, which we spelled out in some detail in the commission report.
Lee Hamilton, what's your response to those folks? And by the way, we did a full segment on this program on Building 7 and some of the conspiracy theories regarding 9/11, but what's your general response to folks who think 9/11 was an inside job or pre-planned?
I just don't think there's very much evidence for it, and there's a good bit of evidence for what we found. We were charged with the responsibility of determining how this happened, Building 7 and all the rest of it. We wrote the story in a very telling chapter, the first chapter of the report, bestseller incidentally in the book sales in this country. I think that story has basically held up. There are a lot of people who don't agree with all the facts of it, but at the end of the day, you can't just theorize here. You have to bring forth hard facts. When you're investigating these complicated events, you get thousands of suggestions. Literally every morning, hundreds of emails would come in with suggestions of what should be done and what should not be done. You go through those things the best you can with a limited staff. You make judgments as best you can under the circumstances. I think we basically got it right on the evidence we had. Now, evidence may develop in years ahead that will change some part of our story. I don't think it has thus far. I think we basically got it right. You've got to get hard facts to support any idea that you have with regard to what happened on that terrible day.
Lee Hamilton, former representative, former vice chair of the 9/11 Commission, now the director of the Center on Congress at Indiana University. As always, we appreciate your being on the Washington Journal.
Thank you.
that again to me so everybody can hear?
Yeah, there's a submission process. So I submitted the piece, and they said they have a review committee, and they have a series of meetings with this committee, and a group of the museum's curators get together and they decide which pieces they want to acquire for their permanent collection. After a few months of review and all kinds of bureaucracies and meetings, they decided to acquire my piece. This museum is a shrine to 9/11. I mean, it is the official museum of 9/11. So to have a piece in there that represents the ideas of the 9/11 truth movement and enshrined to what I assume is a shrine to the official narrative, it kind of, to me, it's like putting a monkey wrench in there or putting questions into that, that whole structure. I love that idea. It's going to be in the officially sanctioned halls of this museum, and it's questioning the whole thing this museum was based upon. So there's a great irony to that.
Listen, we're almost at the 9/11 Museum. We're going there, we're down to the Bloody Beast. We're going to deliver this artwork that kind of challenges the official narrative. My little piece that we're going to deliver today is just one little chink in their armor. And I'm proud to have it in there, and I'm glad, to their credit, that they're going to put it in there. Now, I don't know if they're going to stick it in, the corner or never see it again or disappear it, but I want it in there. I want it on record that it's in there. And we'll see. I have questions. I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. They're going to have my work in there. No. I would start it. I'm sorry? I have the one here, 16th floor, 16th. That is over.
So what floor? 16th.
With the 9/11 Museum collection.
You'll see the young ladies at the reception desk, so they'll announce you if you have an appointment.
Thank you.
Yes, we're all together. Alexander's expecting.
Are you on now? Thanks so much. Right here. 16. Wrong.
Let's get started. Let's take a look at the artwork and we'll take it from there.
Janelle,
That's great.
This was the original, magazine for your archives.
Thank you.
So you can have this. This is where it was published in the Village Voice.
That's nicely done. That's beautiful.
Great. I'm glad you like that.
Yeah.
A lot of my work is collage and paint.
So will you talk a little bit about the creation process? Voice commissioned you for this piece, and we started researching the truth movement. Will you speak a little bit to how aspects of the movement inform some of the iconography in this particular artwork?
Sure. I saw 9/11 happen from my roof on Houston Street. I watched the whole thing happen, and I was, personally impacted me. Being in this neighborhood, obviously. So I heard the first plane hit, and I thought a truck might have crashed into my building. And as I looked out, I didn't see a truck on Houston Street. Then I looked the other way, and I saw smoke coming out from the Twin Towers. And obviously, you knew something really momentous had occurred. Went along with the official narrative, and like everybody else did. And then I got this assignment, and when I got this assignment called Fakes on a Plane about this series of films that kind of question the official narrative, I started looking into it just as research really for the project itself. And I knew nothing about the 9/11 Truth Movement, and even the idea of it was kind of absurd to me, that somebody would question the story. What are you going to question? Just this is the way it happened. So I went into it thinking these guys are nuts, and they're obviously just kind of crazy people. And I was prepared to do an illustration to kind of reflect that temperament, that, you know, these people are insane. And so I spent a couple of days doing research, and some friends of mine started sending me movies, and I researched the films that are in there's a whole list of them here in the actual story. Loose Change, Painful Deception, can't read without my glasses, Terror Storm, 9/11, In Plain Sight. And there was a few others, and then, you know, you start going down that rabbit hole, and next thing you know, you're seeing all kinds of evidence from people in the intelligence communities and in military and in foreign intelligence, and pilots and architects and engineers and physicists. And so I went in thinking these guys are crazy, and I came out thinking they have a lot of valid points and a lot of questions that are very scientific, very logical, very rational, and they haven't been answered by the 9/11 Commission report. So these are valid questions, and I don't see a problem with asking these questions, and I think that they need to be addressed as part of the official record. So,
could I just interrupt you with a question?
Sure.
How far along was the article when you were commissioned to do the artwork? And you know,
and did you see the article before you did it?
Right.
Yes.
Did that kind of?
Yes, I got the article, and I started researching. You know, just doing research like I do for any illustration project, just to try to understand what the story's about. So, like I say, I went in very reluctant to embrace any of these ideas. As a matter of fact, I was hostile to them because I took it kind of as a personal affront that they were challenging my beliefs and my, you know, notions of what happened that day, and even my memories of what happened that day. So it was a personal attack, and it was obviously, you know, I mean, I think of myself as a patriotic American. I think of myself as someone who respects the principles this country was founded upon, and I take these things very seriously. So I didn't go into it lightly, and I went into it in a very sober and deliberate fashion, and tried to do my diligence as far as researching it. And like I said, a lot of evidence presented itself to me that made me kind of join the guys that I felt like I was commissioned to make fun of. And it's been a long road since there. I kind of, you know, I've done further research, and I still think a lot of these questions haven't been answered. And it's all part of just trying to understand what is reality and what really happens, and to what extent are we being deceived. And it's a personal journey, and it's a journey that every American, I think, should go through. Just as anybody who questions and wants to get to the heart of understanding the true nature of the country and the reality they live in.
Is this a self-portrait? Is that you?
It kind of turned out to be. I mean, not literally, but it was me. You know, a symbolic me, where somebody looking at all the evidence and tying all the things together, and this kind of, you know, it's obviously this cliched motif of the somebody on a billboard trying to solve a murder mystery, which is what this was. It was a crime scene. It was a mystery, and trying to put it all together, like who done it and who benefited, and you know.
Is this the sort of crime scene?
Yeah, it's kind of putting together. You know, I don't know if you ever saw The Beautiful Mind, where
yes,
he puts together it's connecting the dots, basically.
Oh, okay.
So it was connecting the dots throughout history and trying to make sense of it on a historical basis. You know, there is a history of these kind of false flag events, and is this another one? And if it is, can you prove it is? And are intelligence people coming forward and saying it is?
Did the magazine, did the newspaper or you get feedback on your painting?
Just positive, from as far as I know.
You said that you got the impression that you were commissioned to be critical of it. I haven't had the luxury of reading the article. Is the article critical?
The article is pretty even-handed. They kind of just say, like, this is classic conspiracy, kind of lurid films, but they don't really go after them. But the phone call I got from the art director, the original phone call, was kind of like, look, these guys are nuts, you know. So that was put into my head, and I just kind of went in thinking that art directors always give you clues as to, you know, what they kind of want the spin on the story to be. So I kind of deviated from what I felt like I was being commissioned to do. into just kind of not really promoting or rejecting these ideas, but kind of putting some of them out there. Some of the information that I learned from physicists like Stephen Jones and from intelligence people like Robert Baer and very serious people. So I kind of tried to distill it. I wish I had a bigger piece. I would love to done this thing full size, you know, like a whole, like a room like this, and tied, because there's so many more pieces to the story. This is just like a little abbreviated version where you can fit into one page. But
is this the only work that you have on the topic, or have you?
No, it's kind of this kind of started an obsession of mine. I mean, an artist needs to be obsessed with something, and I was obsessed because I saw this happen and it viscerally affected me and my life. And I mean, there's so much mythology out there, you know, all over the place, and it takes discernment to try to figure out. All right, some people are telling ridiculous stories, and there's also official channels that are not answering information, not giving you the truth, and you kind of have to look at both sides or 1,000 sides and put it together like a puzzle, and that's what I was trying to do with this piece.
I haven't gotten a close look at the original, but the scan that you sent us, I saw President Kennedy in there. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the kind of historical, the links, how, you know, I think you had said.
Oh, you could see Kennedy on the stand, yeah.
Can you speak to some of these non-directly 9/11 related elements?
Well, this was the most shocking to me from a historical perspective. Looking back, as part of my research, I started reading about Operation Northwoods. I never heard of Operation Northwoods. They didn't teach me that in class, you know, in history class. So I went and I Googled it, and there it is on Wikipedia. You can read it. It's declassified now what happened. It was a plan during the Cuban Missile Crisis, so right during that era, where they wanted to take Castro out. And it was a plan approved by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, by Defense Secretary McNamara. The plan was they were going to blow up a plane of civilians over Miami, blame it on Castro as a pretext to invade Cuba. Now, they were going to blow up innocent Americans in a plane. And this plan was approved by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, by Defense Secretary McNamara, Robert McNamara. You can look it up. I mean, this is all declassified. This is completely verified information. So I started thinking, and it, you know, to his great credit, Kennedy said no. But maybe would a lesser president have said yes? Would somebody like George Bush say yes? I don't know. Maybe. He said no. He had the final word. So that really made me, I mean, the fact that these plans are put out there, this is historically, you know, verified information. So, and there's a history of them, these black operations. So that one is documented, and there's many more that are kind of, you know, in the realm of, there's been whistleblowers that have come out and talked about them, but they're not completely declassified. But anyway, there's a history of it. It's a way of, it's a tactic.
Well, I think it's fascinating that that's the connection that you're drawing with representing Kennedy in the piece, rather than, you know, what I think maybe other not as well-informed visitors might see looking at it, which is that it's about the grassy knoll, it's about the conspiracy surrounding his assassination.
That's,
so
yeah.
You know, in a way, I think each of these elements require a little bit of explanation as to what your motivation was for putting it in the piece.
Absolutely, and that was the reason I put Kennedy in the Operation Northwoods connection. But what I'm hoping is people see this, and you know, maybe they see Operation Northwoods and never heard that term, and they Google it and look. Do your own research, make up your own mind. You know, I'm not trying to be completely didactic here to just say, look, this is, I have it all figured out, and this is the way it is. It's like I'm putting questions out there because I don't. I have questions. That's why the name of this piece, I call it questions, because it's not called answers. It's called questions because I have questions.
And what about some of the other elements, or these? Well, I mean, I recognize these, of course, and those, but are these cutouts from other ephemera that you...
Well, this is a drawing I did
collected?
of Dick Cheney, and...
Oh, so it's your own drawing?
That's my own drawing, and there was a 2000 meeting, a report, the PNAC document, Project for New American Century, where he said we need a Pearl Harbor type event to kind of get his agenda of what he thought was the best course for America to get through. So they had the Patriot Act waiting. They had all these plans for all these various invasions of Iraq and 7 other countries that Wesley Clark talks about. All those plans and war plans were put into place before or right after 9/11. And they lay it out in the PNAC document. You can read it online. Where they're looking for a reason to casus belli, a pretext to launch their agenda into reality.
I was curious about this, the Bloomberg group.
Yeah, that's something. I mean, there's a lot of these things that you start researching and you kind of come across. The Bilderberg Conference is a group of global planners that get together, some of the biggest names in political power, corporate power, finance. Globally, they get together every couple of years, and they talk about, kind of steering how they can help influence what they think is the best course for the global agenda in a certain direction. Mm-hmm. And it's just a meeting where very powerful people are talking about policy, they're talking about ideas, they're talking about wars, they're talking about economy. And these people are serious people and with considerable political and economic power. And they're planning policy without any transparency. And I want people to research. I want people to do their own homework.
Definitely.
And think of your own mind. You don't agree with me, fine. That's perfectly fine. But at least be exposed to this information, and at least give an alternative view a chance. Because when you just unquestioningly accept what you're given from a top-down system, top-down government or media, you're disrespecting yourself, I think, because has they ever lied to you about anything? Can you really say the answer is no? So why shouldn't you question what they say? They've lied to us about very serious things, we know that. They said nobody's spying on you. They said nobody's reading your emails, and they are. So questioning proven liars doesn't make you crazy. It makes you, in my mind, it makes you just, makes you smart. Like, all right, I don't know, you lied to me about this, maybe you're lying to me about that. So that's really, and let me research, and maybe you're not. Don't lie about everything. Let's find out, let's investigate it. And I think the 9/11 investigation was not thorough and had some serious flaws to it. So I'd like to see, and I think everybody on Earth deserves a real investigation into what happened that day. I mean, you guys have a whole museum here dedicated to this thing. This is serious stuff. This is not, this is not some trivial issue. So let's before we etch into stone what happened, let's find out what happened. Anyway, that's my rant.
It wasn't a rant.
Is this your drawing of Osama bin Laden?
Yes.
Well, hi. What is the technique? Is that on a?
That actually was
on a dartboard.
Yeah, I actually painted that on a dartboard, and just for size sake, like I said, I would have loved to have this life size. So that's actually painting about this big, and I reproduced it and had it shrunk down. But I would love to do something like this. I have a whole room. It's an idea I want to pitch to a gallery too, to have kind of a whole classroom with I have the desks and the blackboards, and I present, this is history according to me, might be right, might be wrong. But this is the way I have done my homework, and this is the way I see things, and it's presented with my best intentions. It's presented, I am completely authentic, and I've done a lot of homework, and my passion is real, and like I say, my intent is only to kind of educate people and make people think about these things.
Well, it's, if nothing, it's certainly provocative and really well done. So
Thank you. That's.
We're really grateful to have such a, you know, at once kind of straightforward and sort of clear representation of this perspective, but at the same time, as evidenced by the conversation about Kennedy, it's not, you know, it's not simple-minded. It's a very complicated result of your research. So I appreciate that it's got that depth to it.
Thank you.
I think it's really well done.
Thank you. I mean, I don't want to be irresponsible. I mean, I know it's putting information out there has power, and so I try to really kind of think about these things before I put things out there. Sometimes I put things out that, you know, just being a political artist, you put things out there maybe more emotionally based than they should be. But this particular piece, I wanted to be a little more, less emotional and more just kind of putting out dry facts.
I was curious about what. So you have, it says false flag here in the corner.
Yeah.
Would you speak to that a little bit?
Well, that was a term I never heard of this term before. I didn't know even what it meant. And like I said, I started doing research that night when I got this assignment. I stayed up all night to do this assignment, and.
What was the turnaround time?
It was pretty quick.
Uh-huh.
A few days, but like, you know, I kind of was digesting everything. So the last night before it was due, I stayed up all night and I just kind of said, "Oh, it's due tomorrow morning." So I have to like I was kind of putting all the pieces together, had them all laid out on my desk, and then the last night I said, now I have to make them a cohesive picture. So I started putting it together, and I came across this term, false flag, and you know, false flag is like when Hitler wanted to invade Poland. He didn't just run into Poland because he would have had the opposition of all of Europe against him. So it was this Operation Himmler, like Gleiwitz in Poland, where it was Himmler's idea. He dressed up Nazis in Polish uniforms, had them come across the Polish border into Germany, and then said he was attacked by Poland. And he killed all his own soldiers, and used that as a pretext to say Poland invaded me, and then had all the tanks ready, and they just, you know, we're going to Poland. So that's kind of the most classic example of a false flag, but there's many others throughout history, and it's, you know, pinning a different country's flag on your operation. It's political people use it all the time. It's you demonize your enemy by attributing a certain crime to them so you can destroy them. I mean, it goes back, you know, ancient history. They used it. The Romans used it. Egyptians used it. It's nothing new.
The strings are intriguing to me because of, you know, the straightforward representation of a web of connections between things, but it also seems to create a shape itself. Was that intentional, like a structure?
I was thinking of doing that. I thought it was a little over the top, like creating a pentagon, or like that crossed my mind as I was creating, and I said, you know what, that's just a little too obvious, a little too. So, but it does have a semi kind of.
It has a shape.
Yeah, it has a shape, and it has there is some symbology there, but I tried not to be too literal, just because I didn't want to. Maybe I should have. I don't know. I thought about that. I did think about that. But the end shape was more suggestive of some sort of kind of Masonic symbology than anything.
got the back of the dollar bill.
Yeah, well, the people who designed the currency in Washington, D.C. were extremely interested in symbology, and then these kind of symbolic lines you can see from, elevations of, floor plans of Washington, D.C. So they were very conscious of it. So these symbols, they all have meaning, so all power. I mean, it's not, where is this pyramid with an eye on top? I mean, what does that have to do with money? It's like, it's a, purposely picked symbol to convey a specific message, and they wrote a lot of weird things in Latin that have a lot of meaning to them too, that a lot of people spend a lot of time deciphering. I'm not an expert on, symbology and all that, and that's kind of a whole esoteric art that I didn't really go down that whole rabbit trail, but.
Well, the Freemasonry thing, you'll never dig yourself back out.
No, I know.
Sorry if I offended.
No, and I agree with you there. So I don't really go down that. There's certain rabbit holes like I want to go down. I want to understand what's really happening. And a lot of it's you get into these kind of esoteric, occultic, almost areas of American history. There's some crazy stuff, but it's still hard to really pin down. But when you have intelligence people talking about actual operations, like that's not. Declassified information. This isn't theories anymore. Now it's like hard history. But it's real history, and that's what I'm interested in. Like, what's the real history? It's like I'm not really interested in fanciful, esoteric theories because you can debate those the rest of your life. But I am interested in knowing the real history, Gulf of Tonkin was a classic example. I have that on here. That story didn't happen the way they said it did, They needed us to, just like Hitler needed to get attacked by Poland to invade Poland, we need to get attacked by Vietnam to invade Vietnam, and we did. And if it doesn't happen, you make it happen. And 60,000 Americans died, and 2.5 or 3 million people in Indochina died because of that event. So these events are incredibly powerful. They move history forward. Or backward, however you look at it, but I love the fact that we're having these conversations because this is what this is designed to do, be a starting point for a conversation. All my artwork is. It's not telling you this is the way the world is. It's saying, let's talk about this. Let's just think about it, talk about it, and agree, disagree, whatever. Do research and just explore what the possibilities are of what's really going on. Is there what you would call a 9/11 truth section, or just is this as part of where would my work be in this fit into your narrative, fit into your collection?
It could fit into a number of places. To answer your first question, I wouldn't say that there's a 9/11 truth section so much as the exhibition that you'll see when you do visit the museum is not fixed. This is certainly a unique donation for us, and it really marks one of the first times that we've taken a piece of artwork into the collection that delves into this aspect of 9/11's legacy. So possibilities are there, and they're a little bit open-ended at this juncture.
Well, I really appreciate the fact that you're amenable to that, and that you appreciate that these questions are worth asking at least, and just having the vision to see this as part of the big picture. Just add to me, to the legitimacy of the museum, and to a lot of other people too.
Thank you so much.
Oh my God, thank you so much.
We're so appreciative.
Very nice. They were very nice. What do we got here? Thank you.
Look at this.
Are we allowed to sign this?
But listen, my initial instinct was right. This whole place is a shrine to official memory.
Oh yeah.
No doubt about it.
My left.
Oh, yeah.
Got it. Got it.
You're pacing back and forth. What do you got to hide over there, Anthony?
I'm an open book about the 9/11 Commission report, except
Yeah. Diretamente do Rio de Janeiro para Curitiba, toda atividade é pouca, hein? Comando Selva, Big Papo Reto, DJ Block Madureira. Sai da frente, sai da frente. Me dá licença aí, porque atrás vem gente. Leva-te da avante, leva-te da avante. Leva-te, porque é a Riviera Mitante. Sai da frente, sai da frente. Me dá licença aí, porque atrás vem gente. Leva-te da avante, leva-te da avante.
Throughout the ages, architects and engineers have designed and built the great structures that have made our world and withstood the test of time. Hi, I'm Ed Asner. Welcome to Architects and Engineers. Let's look now at modern steel frame buildings. This is the Empire State Building, a marvel of modern architecture. It was built to last. Architects and engineers of today use computers to design and engineer buildings that will endure the forces of nature, such as earthquakes, fires, and hurricanes. This modern skyscraper was also built to last. We've seen buildings completely destroyed like this before, but only when done intentionally. Danny Jowenko is the expert on this in Europe. What did he say?
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten. Er is nagesprongen. Dit is in opdracht gebeurd. Dit heeft een team gedaan van experts.
Let's compare. Explosives are used to demolish buildings like this in just seconds. Okay, so it's a controlled demolition. What's the problem with that? Well, it happened on the afternoon of 9/11 at the World Trade Center. Let's just think about this. Controlled demolitions cannot be engineered and rigged in a day. It takes months. And therefore, this event must have been planned in advance.
You hear that? Keep your eye on that building. It'll be coming down.
The building is about to blow up. Move it back. We are walking back. There's a building about to blow up.
Did they actually use the word brought down, and who was it that was telling you this?
The fire department. And they did use the word, we're going to have to bring it down.
And these people heard explosions.
We heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. It looked like there was a shockwave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out. About a second later, the bottom floor caves out. The building followed after that.
He takes his hand off, and you hear 3, 2, 1, and it was boom, 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 boom.
And these reporters recognized it as a controlled demolition.
And I turned in time to see what looked like a skyscraper implosion. It looked like it had been done by a demolition crew. The whole thing just collapsing down on itself.
For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
It was almost as if it were a planned implosion. It just pancaked.
So what's the problem if this was a planned demolition? Well, we are told by government agencies that this building came down as a result of normal office fires. The National Institute of Standards and Technology produced their final report in 2008.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
But what do you think brought down the building?
And what caught my eye is more than 1,300 architects and engineers examine the evidence about Building 7's collapse and disagree with the official report issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology. I certainly am much more open-minded about it than I was, and it is because of the involvement of the 9/11 families and all these engineers and architects.
You are about to hear from architect of 23 years, Richard Gage, AIA, member of the American Institute of Architects and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. Now there are more than 1,500 architects and engineers who say that it could not have been brought down by office fires. They are backed by 9/11 family members who are calling for an independent, unbiased investigation.
I'm Richard Gage. Fires have never before caused the collapse of any skyscraper, even though there are numerous examples of much hotter, larger, and longer-lasting fires in these buildings. And in the case of Building 7, the fire that NIST said started the collapse had actually burned out over an hour before. It could not have caused the collapse, as NIST claims. Yet this 47-story, modern steel-frame skyscraper, which was not hit by an airplane, collapses mostly into its own footprint like a house of cards, as fast as a bowling ball falling off the side of the building, in just under 7 seconds. Listen to the experts.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories. And going from motionless to free fall instantly, that's a bothersome part of the puzzle because NIST never explained it.
We've got a building that came down in its own footprint, so all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time in order for that structure to fall the way that we saw.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
The whole building completely comes down in one continuous motion. There couldn't have been any structural resistance.
According to NIST, the failure occurred at column 79 on level 12. They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
It is possible that you could have a local failure as a result of a connection failing. But the likelihood of that failure dragging the entire building in such a fashion that all the columns would fail at the same time is an impossibility.
Impossibility?
Yes.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
I'd like to know why NIST excluded the document from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel. Why is this forensic evidence not being included in the report?
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel. And yet we have evidence of molten iron. R.J. Lee Company, USGS, and Dr. Stephen Jones's work, all 3 separately found these microspheres.
In the dust, we found what we characterize as unreacted thermitic material in the shape of some very tiny red-gray chips, which have different properties, and in the reaction they produce molten iron, which is the prime indication of a thermitic reaction. And such a reaction can be used to destroy steel structures. What we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples that needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
I've independently seen thermitic activity within 2 separate independent samples of World Trade Center dust. My contention, based on finding thermite residue in the dust, is that it happened before. It didn't happen after in the fires that ensued in the rubble pile afterwards. All the characteristics of the microspheres tell me that thermite was involved in melting those steel beams.
So thermite, if it was present at the World Trade Center and created this molten metal that so many witnesses and photographic evidence shows, would also explain the fact that the fires could not be put out at Ground Zero.
The only thing that is consistent with all of the evidence that we have that could cause such a thing is the use of thermite to cut through the steel.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails, like you're in a foundry.
Yeah, like lava.
Like it was lava from a volcano.
Well, the manual gets into thermite, and if it says if you have melted steel or concrete, which we had on 9/11, we should test for it.
This fused element of steel, molten steel and concrete and all of these things all fused by the heat into one single element.
We're asking for an investigation that follows national standards. There's no excuse to not test for this. If terrorists used explosives in '93, why didn't we test for them? If all these witnesses heard explosions, why aren't we testing for them?
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
So the preconceived notion of NIST is that there's no evidence for explosives, and so there's no point in looking. That is the most unscientific thing that you can possibly think of, not to look because you don't expect to find evidence, and in fact the evidence is overwhelming. They state these conclusions for which there's virtually no evidence, and then they ignore conclusions that can be drawn from the evidence.
The Freedom of Information Act request to NIST was denied with the claim that releasing this data might jeopardize public safety. How could it possibly jeopardize public safety?
The destruction of evidence was a criminal act in itself. It was already being carted away and destroyed when the FEMA investigators got there about a month after September 11th.
You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
The scientific forensic evidence, ignored by NIST, but carefully reviewed by teams of technical professionals, corroborates the hypothesis of explosive controlled demolition. We've traveled to 21 foreign countries and 32 American cities, bringing this evidence to the attention of the public. And we're backed by 9/11 family members and other concerned citizens who are calling for an independent, unbiased investigation.
I'm a family member trying to find out the answers to the murder of 3,000 plus people. The bottom line is that it needs to be investigated properly.
Please look at architects and engineers. People all around the world, scientists all around the world are questioning this. And there's some deep, deep explaining to do.
It took some kind of consciousness raising on my part before I was willing to look at the possibilities. And really, you need to go where the evidence leads.
As an engineer, and I have 3 degrees in engineering, I signed that petition for architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth some time ago because the American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
Look at the evidence. In fact, I'll say this very categorically. Any reasonable person who looks at the evidence that's been brought forward has got to come away with the feeling that something has to be done, a real investigation has to be put forward.
We will never heal. This country will never, ever, ever forget that day. We have to demand a new investigation. I want justice here.
The country owns this. We were all victims. You all should want answers. It's not just ours, not just mine. We all lost something that day.
It's distressing for everyone to come to terms with this evidence. But we must pursue the truth wherever it leads. Look at the evidence and decide for yourself.
It's my pleasure to introduce to you Dwain Deets. Dwain Deets is an engineer, a physicist, and has worked for NASA. And he's here today to talk about an activist organization within the 9/11 Truth Movement that goes by the acronym TAP, which stands for Truth Action Project. And he'll tell you more about himself and about TAP. He has a table in the lobby with some literature that I want you to go and check out. And if you want to be more active in making a difference with the 9/11 Truth information, this organization is specifically for that. So I encourage you to check it out. So I'm now proud to introduce Dwain Deets.
Thank you. I was with NASA in the business of flight research test, and now I'm retired. I'm the vice president of 9/11 Truth Action Project, TAP. TAP began operations in 2015. That grew out of the aspirations for grassroots action expressed by several previous 9/11 Truth groups. 9/11 TAP's mission is to build and mobilize a global grassroots movement to create groundswell of civic support that achieves transparency and accountability for the crimes of 9/11, justice for its victims, and in unwarranted wars, and finally, restoration of our civil liberties. Bill Jacoby is currently the TAP president. I am here on his behalf because he is attending a 9/11 anniversary event in Zurich. It has become apparent that mobilizing a global grassroots movement is increasingly difficult when many millennials either were not alive yet or they're too young to even be aware of the event, to experience it. TAP leaders have decided in order to mobilize these millennials, we need them on board and energizing the movement if we're going to have any kind of success. We want our new message to be, it's not about the past, it's about the future. We are calling for what we are saying 9/11 reset, where the messaging is focused on what 9/11 caused and is still going on today. The emphasis will be on forming grassroots truth action groups called TAGs that will differ from other anti-war groups in that it applies the insights gained from scrutiny of these events that have been used to justify these recent wars. The information on the slide presents some of the main points in a new threefold brochure, which I will have out at the table that you can pick up. It's being introduced today. The next slide draws from the outside part of the new brochure. The right half is the top part of the folded up brochure. The name is 9/11 Reset, and it contains a .org, meaning it will be a URL of its own for a separate web page with a link back to the donate function at the 9/11 TAP.org website. The name also makes clear that this is a campaign as well. The reset messaging will make very clear the control of narrative is the very highest priority of the establishment. The cover-up of 9/11 by the government and corporate media leaves no doubt of that fact. We expect this will attract and energize new and younger volunteers. As they join us, which we expect, we will need to raise $50,000 to obtain computer tools and experienced and dependable support personnel so that we'll be able to communicate effectively on the latest online methods. Again, just the thing for you to take away. It's not about the past. It's about the future. Thank you.